Tātou katoa, hakarau I ke mai nei ringe te karanga o tēnei kaupapa. I roti te pūtahi mātauranga, tēnei whare a tātua, nā mātou I te whiwhi, ki o koutou tainga mai, wainga nui a tātou. Māku I timata tō tātou hui te karakia, me tuku mihi hoki, me tētahi waiata whakakapi, ki te timata tō tātou hui. Morning everyone. I'll nip back into Te Reo Māori shortly, but just to say that we're going to have some words of welcome shortly from myself and representatives from the university, in particular our Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Strategic Engagement, Dr. Erik Lithander. And then we'll acknowledge everyone's arrival today, including our Minister, e mihi ana kia koe I te rangatira. Hoi anō, ka huri hoki a hau I te reo o tōku tūpuna, ki te whakakapi tō tātou hui, nā reira kia ino I tātou. Tērā I te mātauranga te pākaru mai nei hururu tau he ruru matua. He ruru tau whito ki nei pūkinga ki nei wānanga. Ke ai te tohinga anu ki te tohinga arangi ki te wai o tū ki te wai whakaika ko te wai te tauira. He wai tapu, he wai nui, he wai oro oi. Ka pepe kawa wai ka porutu te mokupu taurarangi e heriki he tupua. Ka putu ki te whai ao. Putu ki te ao marama, whano, haramai te toki, haumi e, hui e, tāki e. Kia ha te hau ewa wara, he tiu he raki, he tiu he raki. Nāna ia mai te puputara ki he kiota, e tiki nā atu au te kōtū ko I te pauwhakairo ka tū ki te wai te mata, I oku wairangitanga e. Ati he wa mauri ora. E aku nui, e ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā mātā waka here here mai nei ki waipapa taumatarau. Ki tēnei kaupapa nui, ki tēnei kaupapa nui whakaharahara, a tēnā koutou katoa. Nui ngā mihi ki ngā tini whakapapa e here mai nei, e tai mai nei, I rungi te karanga o te rā, I rungi te kaupapa, I pīkau hia, I rungi o koutou puka whiwhi ki tēnei wā, e mihi ana. Ki a koe e te minitau, te rangatira, tēnā koe. Tēnā koe I o mahi nui mō mātou I roti I Aotearoa nei, ki te whai ngā hua pai, ki a tātou I roti o tini portfolios, I roti o tini whiako mō mātou I te minita tēnā koe, e te raukura no mua ngā Wesley College, e mihi ana ki a koe hoki. Ki a tātou katoa, nā mātāwaka, kei te mihi, kei te mihi, kei te mihi. Kia rātou, ko whetirangitia. E rātou, ko ngaru ki te pō, e moi ana rātou, e whiwhia mātou roi mata aroha, I roti o rātou ngarotanga, rātou katoa, haere atu rā. Tētahi o era tō tātou kaumātua, Bomb Gillies, I ona mahi, te mātanga, te mata mutunga o te 28th Māori Battalion, rātou katoa, nā hoia, noho ki reira, ki te whiwhi o nā wairoa, ki reira, e te pāpā, e moi, whakangaro atura. Tātou katoa, rātou katoa, e noho ki reira, tangi ana te ngākau, kia rātou katoa, tātou ko tai kiko nei ki tēnei ao marama, tēnā koutou katoa. Nōku te whiwhi mai te taha o waipapa taumatarau nei, ki te tuku ene kupu kia tātou, ki te taha hoki o te whare mārea tātari kaupapa, kei ko nei māua ko tui, ki te mihi atu ki a koutou, ki te whakatau I a koutou hoki, I roti te whakaro kotahi, I roti tēnei kaupapa nui, a tēnā koutou katoa. Ku whanaunga no te moana nui a kiwa, mihi ana ki a koutou katoa. Whanaunga hoki, no kiko nei, noko nei, me ngā pito o te ao, tēnā koutou katoa. Hoi anō, ka huri a hau ki te tērā o ngā reo, John Manfred Steedman, whakamara mai tātou katoa. That is to say, good morning everyone. Welcome again, welcome to Te Pūtahi Mātauranga, which is one of the identities of this beautiful building within Waipapa Taumatarau University of Auckland, and we're privileged to host you here for today's conference, a continuance of other conferences held by our school here, our Public Policy Institute, and it's a privilege also to acknowledge this particular kaupapa that brings peoples from throughout the Pacific, and within that we just want to acknowledge the work that you do, Minister, on all of our behalves. And you would have heard in my mihi just the acknowledgement of Wesley College. I've got a few friends that went to that place and relatives, so you always give a shout out to Wesley. So mihi ana kia koe. In my opening gambit, I uttered some words that are from this place. Hea ha te hau e wawara, e wawara. What are the winds roaring yonder? These words were spoken early on by one of our mātanga, we should call him, experts, talking about the arrival of something special upon the north wind. And the metaphorical manifestation of that was the arrival of shells like this onto the shores of the Waitemata, and what they might bring and what opportunities they might represent also. And so when Hobson arrived to build a partnership here with Apihai Te Kawe, that was consolidated September 18th, 1840, they represented a type of engagement of which trade became a part of as well. And so from then to now, we continue to acknowledge all of those such arrangements, acknowledge the idea of kotahitanga, working together, reciprocity, and providing opportunities for the generations in front of us as well. So you're represented by the pupu tarakihi in a metaphorical sense, even though this one here is a 3D printed one, because we like the use of technology also, to see what that might offer us in terms of opportunity again. But again, on behalf of the University of Auckland, on behalf of our Public Policy Institute, on behalf also of Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei, as I stand here, I want to offer these words of welcome on behalf of Tainui Waka also, on behalf of all of our staff here. They contribute greatly in this place of entrepreneurship and trade and building relationships to that end. I want to introduce Tui. She's our kaiarahi of Uni Services, our commercial arm, an entrepreneurial background, here to support us today in this whakatau to you all. So with that, last acknowledgements again, congratulations to those that have organised this conference. I know it's not an easy thing. So mihi ana kia koe te katoa. Kanawhi tēnā mōku, that's enough from me. So kei te mihi kia tātou katoa, all the best for the conference over the next 2 days. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Ka tirohi a te ripeka, I mate ai tari I ki nui, ka iti haere tōku pai, ki ene taonga e mono, ka iti haere tōku pai, ki ene taonga e monoa.
I'm now going to hand over to our MC for today, Jennifer Curtin, and mihi ana kia tātou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Tēnā koutou katoa, nau mai haere mai, ki te Waipapa Taumatarau, mōria mai, o koutou nā kou, o koutou hingangaro, o koutou wairoa, nō reira, nau mai haere mai koutou. Ko Jennifer Curtin tōku ingoa, kei te Waikato e whakatapu au, no kirikiri roa aho, tēnā koutou katoa. Kei te mihi nui ki a korua Michael and Tui for the welcome. And I'm not really here to MC, but just to do some housekeeping before I hand it over to Dr. Erik Lithander. But what I'm saying here is to welcome all of you on behalf of the team at the PPI, a big shout out to our MFAT Manaaki scholars who are doing their public sector leadership training with us these 2 weeks. So thank you for your participation, and it really gives us great pleasure to be working with MFAT again to host this, our 6th ATEPS, so ATEPS 2024. Before I hand over to Erik, I need to welcome you all formally and to welcome the Minister. I need to tell you where the loos are. So you just go out here and you kind of weave around past the lifts. It's not that easy to find them, but, you know, they're there, I promise, sort of over there. No smoking or vaping is allowed anywhere on campus. Please confine your consumption of refreshments to the designated areas. That means don't bring any food in here. And if there's a fire, we have to all make our way out to Salmond Street in an orderly fashion. You can buy coffee at the cafe at the entrance of this building, or at the business school cafe if you fancy a walk. It's just out there and around the corner a little bit. This conference or school is about learning. So it's intentional in its goal to have you network with each other, to learn from each other in the conversations outside this room. So we're hoping that you will make use of the coffee breaks and the kai to share your knowledge and insights as practitioners and academics. We're also hoping you'll ask lots of questions of our speakers, our distinguished speakers, the Minister and Minister Greg, who's joining us later by video. And finally, just to let you know that we're recording these sessions so that we can share it with our Master of Public Policy students over the course of the next 12 months. Kia ora anō, and I'll hand over to you, Erik.
Kia ora, Jennifer. Morena tato, nau mai haere mai, and welcome to Waipapa Tomataro, the University of Auckland, for the Auckland Trade and Economic Policy School 2024 edition, an event which year after year has consistently delivered really informed and robust conversations and discussions, and invariably terrific contributions from our visiting speakers, and I have no doubt that this year will be the same, but more. A special welcome to Minister McClay, who's with us this morning, Minister Grigg, who will be joining us a little bit later, the British Consul General, other distinguished speakers, guests, colleagues, and of course our students. My name is Erik Lithander. I have the privilege of being the university's Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Strategic Engagement. ATEPS is a creation of the University of Auckland's Public Policy Institute, the PPI, which since its launch in 2017 has really established itself as a small but very well-connected and I'd say quietly influential research institute that supports the professional development of policymakers through the Masters of Public Policy and our PhD programs, but also for its connections and partnerships with a range of organizations and the production of evidence-informed research focused on policy processes and outcome here in New Zealand and around the region and around the world. And in 2019, the PPI began working with MFAT to deliver this annual Auckland Trade and Economic Policy School. And since then, we've delivered ATEPS in person, online, in hybrid, and now thankfully back to in person again, and you're all very welcome. This ATEPS is our 6th iteration, and this year we are delighted to have sponsorship from the British High Commission, and I would like to acknowledge the presence today of Rishad Durgari, the British Consul General to Auckland, who will be speaking a little bit later. Content-wise, this ATEPS will focus on the ongoing challenges and opportunities for trade relationships globally and the potential for advancing our relationships with Southeast Asia in particular. Southeast Asia is home to 9% of the world's population and is collectively the world's 5th largest economy. The region offers really strong potential as New Zealand looks to diversify its trade and double the value of its exports in the next decade. ATEPS 2024 will represent a valuable forum to hear from leading experts, as you will have seen in the program, discuss the latest international trade and geopolitical developments. There have been one or two recently. And the associated possibilities for New Zealand's SMEs and entrepreneurs to advance green transitions, connectivity and technology, and to support sustainable food security and Māori business, among other things. You definitely have two very full, but undoubtedly very terrific days ahead of you, and we're delighted to be able to host you at Waipapa Taumatoro, the University of Auckland. Please feel at home on our campus, take a walk around during the breaks, and if we can help you in any way, please don't hesitate to ask. And it's now my great pleasure to introduce you to the Honourable Todd McClay. He is the Minister for Agriculture, Minister of Forestry, Minister for Hunting and Fishing, Minister for Trade, and Associate Minister for Foreign Affairs. He's been the MP for Rotorua since 2008. He's held several ministerial roles in the 5th National Government with portfolios which have included trade, state-owned enterprises, and revenue. Todd has previously been a diplomat. He was the Cook Islands and Niue ambassador to the European Union, has worked extensively in business in Europe, as well as in government and public relations internationally. We are delighted to be able to host him on the campus. And Minister, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, Erik, thank you very much, and kia ora. Good morning, everybody, and a real privilege, a pleasure to be here, actually, for two reasons. Parliament's on, so I'd much rather be here with you. And I normally stand in Parliament, look across. You're much better looking than what I sometimes have to look at when I'm down there. But look, thanks very much for the invite, and it's a very important topic, I think, and hear about what you'll be doing for the next 2 days is well worth your time. And I know you've got some great speakers and others to come and talk to you. Erik, thank you for the invitation. You're very kind. Welcome. I think it was my Wikipedia page you're reading from. I'm going to go and update that. It feels very old now, but thank you for that. Can I also thank the University of Auckland for hosting us, and there are people from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here. Thank you. They work exceptionally hard for us at home and all around the world. When I go overseas as Trade Minister, Agriculture Minister, we go to a trade negotiation or just an international meeting, I have 2 or 3 exceptional officials with me. Australia has hundreds of people with them. There's, the delegations are huge, and man for man, woman for woman, we punch above our weight and do just as well as they do. So thank you for your work. And represent the British High Commission here, and I think the European Union mission also. I've just come back from APEC. We got APEC in Lima in Peru. We were there just for a couple of days. I think I got back Sunday morning. The Prime Minister was up there. He arrived back Monday morning off a couple of very long flights, 5 in the morning, went to Wellington, had a shower and straight to work. And it was important that we're there because you think about the APEC countries, a bit like the G20 a few weeks previously. These are some of the world's big economies, the ones that are very important to New Zealand. And New Zealand gets a seat at the table with them, not only to look for opportunity, but to talk about the things that are important to us and you, New Zealand's values. And we cannot underestimate the importance of being at those meetings. The Prime Minister has been quite clear. He wants us to be a world-leading, small, advanced economy by 2040. And I think a lot of that is already there in our economy. But the reason for that is for us to know that we can do more and we need to do more. In trade policy, one of the things we've done is set the ambitious target of doubling exports by value over 10 years. And we've done that purposefully. It's going to be very difficult to achieve, but we've done it so that we're out on the world stage hustling, so that we're out looking for opportunities for New Zealanders. But we've also done it as a trading nation. As and when we achieve that, it grows the incomes for all New Zealanders and it provides more for us at home. And the only way we can do that is to be out seeing people and sitting around the table, making those contacts. To achieve the doubling export value, we're securing new and diversified high-quality trade arrangements, trade deals with countries and blocks of countries around the world, upgrading our existing agreements and getting more from them, and very importantly, getting rid of what we call our non-tariff barriers and technical barriers to trade, where other countries put in place standards that are different than ours that make it hard for New Zealanders to export, even under a trade agreement, to find ways to negotiate those, to fix them and to get them down. Now, we're almost, I think, next week is 1 year, 12 months of the government having been formed. And so it's a good opportunity to sort of take stock in the trade space of what we've achieved so far. In May, the European Union Free Trade Agreement entered into force many months sooner than was likely to happen. In fact, the predictions would probably only be happening about now. It's a very high quality agreement. It doesn't deliver everything that we wanted, but it's a very, very high quality agreement. And there were $46 million worth of tariff savings for New Zealand exporters delivered as a result of us getting that agreement in place sooner, particularly for the kiwi fruit sector and onion exporters. It meant that almost all of the kiwi fruit season went into Europe tariff-free, and that means on average $16,000 extra in the pocket of every single kiwi fruit grower this year, because we did that so much sooner. And those contracts were already negotiated. So, if you think kiwi fruit's a big industry, but think about every single grower, large and small, $16,000 extra to pay a bit of debt, to talk to the bank manager, to go and spend in their own community makes a real difference. In September, we concluded the New Zealand United Arab Emirates Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. We negotiated that in just 4 months, the fastest ever deal we have negotiated, and it's one of our highest quality free trade agreements. 98.5% of everything we sell them is duty-free, no tariff rate on entry into force, rising to 99% after 3 years. It takes 3 years for our chicken exports to reduce to a zero tariff rate, giving New Zealanders absolute opportunity and preference in that market. And in October, we concluded a trade agreement with the Gulf Cooperation Council, 6 countries, including the UAE in the Middle East. That was unfinished business for successive governments over 18 years ago. That negotiation started 18 years ago. It floundered, it stopped. I was able to meet with a few of the ministers earlier this year, and in 7.5 months we got it landed. It is the highest quality deal the GCC has done with any country or group of countries. It's the first one that they have done with a major agricultural exporter. It means 99% of our exports will be tariff-free over 10 years, and we put the UAE with it 51% on day one. And this is a very competitive market that is very keen for things that we produce. Again, it will give our exporters a big opportunity there. It also, for the first time, has provisions, first time for the GCC, around a number of things, committing to labour standards, international labour agreements, climate change, environment, and a chapter or a section on women's economic empowerment, where the GCC with New Zealand commits to an international agreement against all forms of discrimination against women. And the reason I raise that is that when we go to negotiate trade deals, of course we want better access for our exporters. We want the tariff rates to come down. We want to give you advantage in those markets so that we can sell more, because as we sell more, we make more money for it. It's good for the New Zealand economy. All New Zealanders can earn more. But we also want to talk about the values that are important to New Zealand and New Zealanders. And we do it directly, we do it respectfully, we can do it publicly, and where we have an opportunity to have that language in our trade agreements, we do that also. And then last week when I was in Peru, we signed the ACS agreement, an agreement on trade and sustainability with Costa Rica, Iceland and Switzerland, our first agreements with those 3 countries. It removes tariffs on 45 wood and wool products. It's very good for our sheep farmers and for wood producers, but it focuses on a lot of environmentally friendly goods and services and gets tariff rates down on those, and for the first time agrees rules around labelling of what is environmentally friendly. And so trade agreements often cover everything. In this case, we've focused on things that are sustainable only, and what that means is it gives New Zealand exporters an advantage in those markets, and it's an agreement that's open for others to join over time. We also have led 8 trade missions around the world. We made a commitment coming to government that we want to do more trade missions in the next 3 years than any government had ever done before. When I became minister, I had to ask how many that was, because in making the commitment, I didn't know. and it's quite a lot. We have to do 20. The last time we did that was when we were in government previously, and I was the trade minister then. And so far we've done missions to Brazil, China, Japan, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, Korea, Thailand, and to the US. Resulting in 105 commercial outcomes worth millions of dollars for New Zealand businesses. And just in the last month or two that I led to Brazil and one to China, we did 13 deals in Brazil, worth $100 million of extra exports over 3 years, and China 24 deals worth an extra $340 million of exports additionally for New Zealand companies over the next 3 years. Growing New Zealand's trade relationship is part of our plan to grow the economy, lift incomes for all Kiwis and create jobs. 1 of every 4 jobs in New Zealand is dependent upon exports. And we know that businesses that export earn more and pay their workers more than companies that don't, for a range of reasons. And so what we want to do is have more New Zealand companies able to export, give them more access to markets around the world, make it easier for them to do so, because it grows New Zealand's economy, and it means directly New Zealanders have more certainty, but at the same time they can earn more. The other thing that we need to focus on almost single-mindedly is these other barriers to trade. So you all know that a barrier can be a tariff rate. If you enjoy New Zealand wine and you think others around the world should share it, I agree with you. But if you want to go to India and you want to buy a bottle of New Zealand wine, when it arrives at their port, they put 150% tax on it. So your $10 bottle of wine costs $25 when it gets there, and the poor old New Zealand producer only gets the $10. That's a tax. Australia has a trade deal with India. They were able to negotiate that during COVID when countries were locked down. They found a way to do a deal when we couldn't. That duty rate or tariff rate for them has gone from 150% on their wine to 75%, and it will continue to fall. New Zealand wine is twice as good as Australian wine. Very easy, right? But a $10 bottle of wine should be $10, not $25. And so we want to do a trade deal to get that down to level the playing field. But as well as tariffs that get in the way of trade, there are many other barriers as well. And it means that when we have a right to sell into a market, when it's too hard, too expensive, too hard, then Kiwis can't make the most of that. So this year we've been focusing on it already. We've removed at least 16 of these barriers to trade, worth over $733 million worth of exports. And just to run through a few of them to give you an idea, we reduced the regulatory burdens for wine and spirits exports to the EU around labelling, which meant it was very hard to get the products in there. We had to change the labels at a great cost. We fixed that, resolved the barrier on medical device exports to Mexico. Restored onion exports to Indonesia, New Zealand's largest onion market, through working out phytosanitary certification. New Zealand onions couldn't go in there, they were blocked. If you go down to Pukekohe, they were very grumpy about that, and we were able to negotiate recognition of standards so they can go there again. We restored access for up to $250 million worth of log exports to India. New Zealand changed the way you're allowed to fumigate logs before they were exported. India didn't recognise our new system, which meant that because of what we'd done, we couldn't sell them logs anymore. We're missing out on $250 million worth of exports that stopped overnight. We've been able to negotiate recognition of our new system to start, and we'll keep doing that. We extended tariff-free access for New Zealand digital exports to all WTO members earlier this year. We were able to get certification so blueberries from New Zealand can be exported to Korea. We restored $88 million worth of frozen deer velvet exports to the very valuable Chinese market. And then to our European friends here, thank you. We received a 12-month reprieve over what would be very costly EU deforestation regulations that would have meant that New Zealand exporters had to prove that the goods that they were sending there were produced on land that hadn't been deforested, something that's very hard for them to do, and something that's not necessary because the government can already do that because it's illegal to cut down native trees in New Zealand, and we think that we shouldn't have to pay that. The government should be be able to meet that requirement, and so that's been put off for 12 months, which is a help. Over the next 12 months, we're targeting more. There's another $900 million worth of these NTBs we want to fix. So we're looking for a permanent exemption from the EU around those deforestation regulations. We want to try and get a ban on structural timber from New Zealand going to Australia lifted. Australia doesn't allow New Zealand structural timber to go in there, even though they have a timber deficit. They need more wood, and it's because their standards say that New Zealand wood is too soft to be used for structural timber. They can't be right because our houses are not falling down. We just have to find a way to get them to recognise a standard, and we're engaging quite constructively. That'll be worth $250 million in the first year to our exports, and it means fewer logs going over the port, more logs going through sawmills in New Zealand, creating jobs and extra value, which is really important for our economy. We want to look at removing restrictions around cosmetic exports to China. It's worth about $300 million. It's something that we've done, the way we've changed our rules that make it hard to get it in there. We're looking at how we can fix that quite quickly, and we want to continue to take action against Canada, who have restrictions in place around our dairy exports, and I'll deal with that now. So the reason we do these things is largely because New Zealand's an export nation. We produce enough food to feed 40 million people around the world. In fact, nobody gets all of their food from New Zealand. I like to think 400 million people get 10% of their diet from New Zealand every year. We have a very important role to play. We have a reputation for producing high quality, safe, environmentally friendly food. Some of the safest food in the world, and certainly some of the most carbon efficient food produced anywhere in the world. And we know that the world wants this food, and they were willing to pay well for it. But we can only get that to them if we have good trade agreements where we can compete fairly, and we have rules in place that allow New Zealanders to export. We have a number of trade agreements with countries around the world. When you negotiate and sign a trade agreement, you are entering into a binding commitment to meet an obligation. We say to people, you can have access to the New Zealand market. In return, we want access to your market. We're happy for your businesses to come down here and be able to work here on the condition New Zealanders can go in the other direction and do that. And you need trade agreements to be fairly well balanced. You have the opportunity to buy and sell similar amounts from each other, and when they work in that way, businesses do well. Where countries don't meet their or won't meet their obligation to New Zealand, we will take action against them to ensure that New Zealanders get what they have negotiated and what they deserve. One of our most important free trade agreements is the comprehensive CPTPP, the comprehensive trade, let's call it the CPTPP. It's a very long name. In fact, I was the minister who signed the first one, the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There you go. And then America pulled out. We were able to renegotiate it, and we added the words comprehensive and progressive to it, so some of the other countries wanted to continue. Anyway, the point of this is it is one of the highest quality agreements the world has seen done. It represents a very large amount of the world's economy, and it is ambitious, and it is lucrative, and it delivers. And the reason we know that is many countries are asking to join it now, which is a good thing. And New Zealand can be very proud of that because it was largely negotiated and signed here, and we're the repository, we're the people that sort of hold the pen to be responsible for it. In that, we have given almost all of the countries free access to New Zealand. In some areas where we didn't get full access to their markets, we've agreed quotas, in this case dairy into Canada. And unfortunately, Canada is not meeting that obligation to New Zealand. They're not allowing dairy products to go into Canada as they should. The previous Labor government started a dispute case against Canada under the agreement, which we in opposition supported, and a panel found in New Zealand's favour that Canada wasn't meeting its obligation. Sadly, Canada today is still not doing that. Although they've made changes, they're still not meeting that obligation. And they knew what they were entering into when they came down to New Zealand to sign that deal. We take our obligations seriously. We expect others to do the same thing. So the government has decided to take the case further with Canada. We have started a procedure where they must come and formally discuss this with us. we seek a change to allow New Zealand dairy product to go into that market, or they must pay us compensation. And in the case they choose not to do so, we reserve the right to take any action that is allowable under that agreement to stand up for the rights of New Zealanders, including, if necessary, we wouldn't want to, but if necessary, to put tariff rates back in place. The reason this is important is because you don't want a trade dispute, but actually trade works well when you have rules that businesses can rely upon and gives them certainty, and when they are honoured. And New Zealand honours our obligation. We expect our partners to also do so. The very good news is we are good friends with Canada. We work very well together. We do a lot internationally in many areas, particularly in trade. And this won't ruin that relationship, but they owe us an obligation, have an obligation to us, and they must meet it. And I say to them very clearly, the ball is now in their court, but the time is running out. They must meet their obligation to New Zealand dairy farmers. The final bit that I actually just want to touch on, just looking at the audience, is another agreement that we've had for a period of time that we can also be very, very proud of, because trade agreements are squarely about trade. We can talk about other things and become ambitious, but they're squarely about trade, with the exception of a group of countries very closest to us that we have a very, very important respectful relationship with and their close neighbours, and those are the Pacific Islands. So when I was Minister last time, we were able to conclude the PACER Plus agreement, which I call a development and trade agreement. And the reason for that is it is about trade, but it's about actually helping these economies to grow and to develop, and they have a development component in them as much as a trade agreement. When you do trade agreements, normally you force others' hands so you can get the very best deal that you can. In the case of the PACER Plus agreement with Australia, we took the decision that actually when countries were ready to join, they should be able to. But if they weren't ready to join, we wouldn't force them to. So rather than waiting till everyone had agreed, we said the agreement is now open for others to join. We went to Tonga, I think, to sign it. Many of the Pacific Island countries joined, not all of them, and some of them are still looking at that, Fiji and Papua New Guinea. And the reason that we've done this is actually trade, when balanced, can grow economies and provide opportunity for our citizens. And, as well as helping economies to develop, we want them to be able to trade with the world. And so we've had an opportunity this year to engage with Fiji and start talking about what we would need to do for them to come and join this agreement. And I've got to say I have a huge amount of respect for their minister, the Deputy Prime Minister of Fiji. I invited him to come and join the Australian Minister and I in Rotorua, where we had a wonderful weekend, including doing some work. And we have started the discussion about the sensitivities Fiji has. And rather than saying, well, we're bigger than you as an economy, you must do what we want, with Australia, we've committed to finding solutions to their concerns so they can benefit from the agreement, and at the same time, we can allow trade to move in both directions. And I just say that to you because actually sometimes trade feels like just very transactional buying and selling. There are many reasons that we want to trade with people in the world and have agreements, and most of them is because when like-minded countries get on and we can be sensible and we can agree these common rules, it's good for the economies of both countries, it's good for the citizens of both countries, and that's one of the jobs of a trade minister. Can I thank you for inviting me along here today? I hope I wasn't too long. There's another 5 pages there that I'll leave for my deputy who's coming a little bit later, but the very, very best of luck. The final thing I guess I would say around trade, it's often not well understood. It's not, sometimes in the media you'll hear all things about it. You can rest assured when I, with trade officials, go overseas to negotiate with people, we're going there to get the very best deal for New Zealand. It's great if we can fix the problems of the world, but that's actually someone else's job. Every time we go away, it's to make sure we can get everything that we can for New Zealand. We'll get a good deal for New Zealand because trade grows incomes, and in every single company in New Zealand that exports, they pay their workers more, well, almost all of them, they pay their workers more than a company that doesn't export. And the way that we become a wealthier country so we can all have a better and higher standard of living and quality of life is to sell high quality, safe products to others. Thank you.
I'm Steve Noakes. I teach here at the University of Auckland in Politics and International Relations. I'm a colleague of Jen's and several others in the room. I am director of the China Studies Center, which is housed in the New Zealand Asia Institute across the way at the business school. And this is panel 1, Geopolitics, Economics, and Trade. We're joined by 3 fabulous experts. We have Professor Natasha Hamilton-Hart, who is director of the New Zealand Asia Institute and a specialist in politics of Southeast Asia. We have Professor Shiro Armstrong visiting us from ANU. Welcome. And we also have Sarah Salmond from MinterEllisonRuddWatts to my immediate left. We've got someone handling the signage for us. There we are. Thank you very much. Have you got something you'll hold up for the panelists? Each person's got about 15 minutes. I'll ask everybody to stick to that close as you can, so that we can have enough time left over for everybody to get in on the discussion. How does that sound? All right. In that case, I'm going to pass the microphone to Natasha. Please go ahead.
All right, thank you very much for that introduction. It's great to be here again. I'll try and come in under 15 minutes, so give me a nudge. And I want to make 3 basic points. One is around the geostrategic context that trade and engagement with Southeast Asia takes place. The second is around how Southeast Asia is positioned within that geostrategic context. And thirdly, go over some of the implications for New Zealand and New Zealanders who want to engage, whether for business or in the government-to-government space. So let me start around the geostrategic context. And the first point I want to make here is that the region, and this is really the wider East Asian region or the Indo-Pacific region, is undergoing what has been called an order transition. And I'm borrowing the words of my colleague at ANU, Evelyn Goh. We're not just seeing a power transition in which the previously dominant power, the United States, sort of hands over the baton to China, and the region just shifts from an American-led one to being a Chinese-led one. I mean, Evelyn and other people, and I agree with her, have said something more fundamental is changing. The nature of the regional order, the structure of the regional order is changing, and one of the ways that very significantly that it is changing is that it was, for most of the post-war period, a US-led region. And that was the context in which the regional growth miracles unfolded and the region became an integrated supply chain base for many products. It is not going to become a Chinese-led region. It is going to be a multipolar region with a number of different countries exercising power and pursuing their material interests in different ways. It's going to be much harder to calculate what different players will do. There isn't going to be a simple balance of power that you can easily measure up, and that is going to mean a lot more uncertainty. And just a few points on, I think the rise of China is very real, and its increase on power on multiple dimensions, economic and military, is very real, but it is unlikely to be able to play the role the US has played, even if it wanted to, and there isn't any clear indication that it wants to, but some of the reasons why it couldn't is, one is geography, and that is China is in the region in ways that the US is not, and therefore other countries react to it quite differently because there isn't the Pacific Ocean in between. And secondly, the economy in China is still oriented towards investment and production, not consumption. The US, of course, is the consumer economy par excellence. And thirdly, it is a closed society in the ways that the US is not. And let me just say one indicator of this is there's probably, more Vietnamese in California than in China. And the US is a country of inward migration and diaspora communities that then build links with other societies. There's a lot of outward migrations historically from China, but there isn't a whole lot of inward migration. And this may change, but not just now. The second point I want to make is around Southeast Asia itself. So the US-China strategic competition is the context in which Southeast Asian countries are now operating just the same as we are. And this US-China conflict means that these two countries are both pursuing, at least to a great extent, what can be called a relative gains advantage, which means that they do stuff that might make themselves worse off, but as long as it damages the other player more, there is a kind of rationality to it. It's a perverse logic, relative gains, but nonetheless, that's the one you get when security concerns come to the fore. Now, Southeast Asia has grown and prospered as a region pursuing a very different kind of economic logic, which is the pursuit of absolute gains. After its own internal political upheavals was settled decisively in the 1960s and 70s in favour of pro-growth capitalist coalitions of varying kinds, not necessarily the free market kind, but nonetheless very solidly growth-oriented capitalist societies, they have been pursuing absolute gains, and I think they still are dominated by growth-seeking coalitions. Now, these coalitions domestically vary from country to country, and the kind of growth that they are seeking isn't always the kind that New Zealand would prefer. You know, our exporters of beef into Indonesia have been repeatedly knocked back, despite the best efforts of MFAT to win cases in the WTO, because there is effectively a protectionist food security, food sovereignty coalition operating in that policy space in Indonesia. Nonetheless, it may be around protectionism and rent-seeking in some cases when those coalitions have the upper hand, but other times more internationalist coalitions predominate in the local political economies of these countries. And these present, opportunities for New Zealanders to engage with the region. The region, of course, is at the moment benefiting greatly from the US-China conflict in that a lot of the trade diversion has flowed into the region, a lot of the investment has flowed into the region, and so countries producing semiconductors, clean tech supply chains, auto industries and others, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia particularly, have seen an influx of investment. That investment actually in most recent years has been dominated by China, although there are also American and other companies that have benefited from it. So although the stock of foreign investment in the region is very much American dominated and also intra-regional, the new supply chain connections that are being built in the region actually have very significant roles being played by Chinese companies, and that is part of the context that we work in. How much time have I got here? 5 minutes. Let me move on to talk about a few implications for New Zealand, because I think our engagement in the region we need to be aware of both the geostrategic context, the big picture US-China rivalry and the structure of power, but also the domestic political economy contexts in the regional countries. And I want to start by reminding people that this is 11 countries in the region, ASEAN, and then East Timor as well. People often refer to ASEAN as a region. It is an organisation of independent sovereign countries. It is not the equivalent of the EU, the EU. Any exporter going into the region will need to deal with different tariff levels, different non-tariff barriers, different regulatory standards, and different political economies. And if you're actually looking, who are my allies and who are my opponents in these countries, who are the forces lined up for and against me, it is going to look different in all of these countries. So you cannot treat the region as a sort of singular block. What it appears to me is that, for our traditional commodity sort of food exports, you might think there's not a lot of spillover from the geostrategic conflict that is also unfolding. But this could change, and my hunch is that it will become more apparent as the competition escalates into areas like cloud storage, data standards. I know we have a whole session on data later, so I won't go into that. Questions about where your data is stored, what kind of interoperability you've got, what kind of hardware you're using for your comms infrastructure. So some of our even non-sensitive exports may end up being affected, particularly if either the US or China, but it looks at the moment like the push is coming from the US, particularly, I don't think any of it's going to change in this respect with the new administration, as they become more assertive in trying to effectively develop separate supply chains so that, in order to access the US market or to do business with the United States, you're going to have to vet your supply chain partners, and that will include in Southeast Asia. And it will apply both potentially to our sort of commodity exports, but also to many of the tech area that we are hoping to grow. So I have a research project that we've started. We don't have full results yet, but we're looking at the top 200 New Zealand companies, the 10-200, and looking at how exposed they are to various kinds of potential export control regime that we might have coming down the road. For Southeast Asian countries, at the moment it looks like they're trying to maintain the region as a sort of open and neutral space. So Malaysia's Prime Minister Anwar has very much said, everyone can come and set up a cloud storage centre in Malaysia. We'll have Tencent and Alibaba, and we'll also have Amazon and so on. So they're trying to maintain sort of do business with everybody. We don't want to choose. To some extent, in some areas that will be possible. Sometimes there will be a technical workaround that you can apply that might impose greater costs and friction, but is nonetheless still workable. And for other companies, it will mean you need to make a choice. So obviously our companies like Rocket Lab, Gallagher Security, others, they can't work on both sides. They will have to choose. And I think the final point I'll just make is that the Southeast Asian countries are caught very much as New Zealand is, with our largest export market and our primary growth potential lying in one area, and our traditional sort of security alliances and partnerships and concerns pushing us in the other direction. I think we see a mixture of somewhat incoherent policy in many countries as they wrestle with these contradictions. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'll ask you to pass the microphone last.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks to Jen and the team here for the invitation. It's a real delight to be on this panel, although I think the news I'm going to deliver and the thinking isn't exactly great news, but I think hopefully there's a bit of hope, just as Natasha demonstrated. We do have ways through this. So I also want to talk about 3 points and make 3 points. The first is on the risk of contagion of protectionism. The second is the idea of this economic security, it's a new area that a lot of countries are putting policies in place, the overlap of economics and security. And then finally, what countries like New Zealand, Australia, and the countries in Southeast Asia, what kinds of things we might be able to do in response. So the first point, we are staring down a huge rise in protectionism from the United States. Already we had Trump from 2017 for 4 years, initiate a trade war, and become much more inward-looking with America First policies. The Biden administration has doubled down on that and continued that. So whoever would have won the recent election, we were looking at a pretty bad picture for multilateral trade and for rules, international rules in the economic order. I think with Trump's win, that's just going to be harsher and ruder, the way we're hit with tariffs. So he's promised 60% tariffs on Chinese imports going into the United States and 10 to 20% tariffs on all imports going to the United States. I think we need to take this seriously and take this literally. The political instinct in China, like the first time around in 2017, will be to retaliate. You can't afford to look weak to your domestic constituents. And I think other countries will try to retaliate as well. The European Union retaliated the first time around. Other countries like Australia did deals with the Trump administration to get out of these trade restrictions, but those deals were not consistent with the established multilateral rules. We signed a voluntary export restraint, which was a quota, which was ruled illegal essentially after the Uruguay round in '95. So there's a really big risk here that we start to do deals that further undermine the economic order and the multilateral system. Now, already, as Natasha mentioned, we're seeing Chinese goods that are shut out of the United States flooding into Southeast Asia and elsewhere. It's putting a lot of pressure on Southeast Asian countries and governments to, quote-unquote, protect their domestic competition with a surge of competition of cheap goods from China. That's going to get worse. If the average tariff rate is about 20% now of Chinese goods that the Chinese goods have to face going into the United States, that goes up to 60%, we're going to be flooded with more Chinese goods everywhere else. So there's a big risk, I think, of countries retaliating, Southeast Asian countries putting up barriers, tariffs towards Chinese imports, and we face global contagion of this protectionism. That's not so far-fetched. There's a real risk that this leads us to a 1930s-like breakdown of the global trading system. We created this system, of course, in response to that breakdown of beggar thy neighbour, retaliatory policies of the 1930s, and that system now looks like it's under threat. It's going to be difficult for New Zealand to achieve that doubling of exports in 10 years, as the Minister said, if markets are closing up everywhere. And this is where I come to Southeast Asia that I think has the most to lose. We did, the Australian Productivity Commission, and I was brought in as a consultant, did a report in 2017 on rising protectionism. You know, we're facing down American tariffs and response from China and maybe global contagion. And what might an Australian or small country response be? And I consider Australia as a small open economy here, where outside of China and the United States, we're all middle powers, small powers, but importantly, small open economies. Well, with global contagion of 15 percentage points increase in tariffs, we were looking at about a 4% fall in global GDP. Now, to put that into context, during the global financial crisis, global GDP fell by 1%, so a much bigger hit than the global financial crisis. So 4% fall in GDP, and Southeast Asia would be hit the hardest. 9% GDP fall in Southeast Asia on average. That's huge. That is not just economic catastrophe, that is political instability. Southeast Asia is most exposed because it has high trade shares. Now, quite often you'll hear people talk about, well, intra-ASEAN, so trade within Southeast Asia, is very low at 20%. In Europe, it's about 60%, North America about 40%. Very little trade within Southeast Asian countries, but that's because Southeast Asian countries, economies, are integrated into the global economy. So they have trade to GDP ratio of above 100%. Much higher than the rest of the world. That's a source of prosperity and security for Southeast Asia. Now, those risks have been managed under a US-led multilateral trading system, but that trade share, the interdependence, is now starting to look like a bit of a vulnerability. There are risks there, and it's not surprising because it's been weaponized by some countries. And I want to get to that weaponization. And so the second point I want to talk about is this overlap of economics and security. You may have heard of it as geoeconomics or economic security policies. Look, as Natasha said, the United States and China are locked into a zero-sum competition. This is not positive-sum win-win, which was what we're used to in trade. Economic competition where you try to invest in infrastructure, education, you're better off, and there are positive spillovers so others are better off. This is about the fight for primacy and number one. So it's about relative gains, as Natasha said, not absolute gains. So the United States sees China's rise, even if the United States as a whole benefits, sees China's rise as a risk and a cost to them. This is where we're headed towards a prisoner's dilemma result, a prisoner's dilemma equilibrium generally, where everybody is worse off, when with cooperative outcomes we could be better off. We can return to a positive sum game. And I hate to say it, but this is where Australia has joined the game. Other countries like Japan are implementing what we call economic security policies that are focused on managing the risks from China's rise. Now, that's because we've been whacked by attempted economic coercion and trade sanctions. The Chinese blocked 20 of Australia's goods, about $20 billion or so worth of goods during COVID, during a political dispute or deterioration in the political relationship. And there's been a huge loss of trust and confidence in engaging with China and having high trade shares with China, because those can be turned around and weaponized. Now, Japan's had a similar experience, and many other countries have had a similar experience, but I'd say we need to learn the right lessons from this, not the wrong lessons. So concentrated markets and high trade shares in critical minerals, for example, where China dominates, are now seen as a national security issue in Australia and elsewhere. Well, it's not so clear to me that this strategy of economic security, protecting trade, protecting investment, is the way forward. And I think we just need to look at Australia's experience with China during this attempted economic coercion, where in fact Australia didn't do so badly. Australian exporters of barley, coal, most of the products except wine and lobsters to a certain extent, found other markets internationally very quickly. So it was the open multilateral system, the open global economy that protected Australia. Of course, flexible markets at home, flexible exchange rate, all of that's very important. But having alternative buyers, alternative sellers globally meant that the economic weaponry from China was blunted. And so Australia did very well out of this, selling barley to other countries, selling coal elsewhere very quickly. It's that WTO that underpins that openness, and although it's under threat, and we can talk a bit about that, and I'm sure we will, it's still a reference point against protectionism. And of course, the WTO acted as the exit ramp for Australia and China from this episode of coercion. So we cannot afford to learn the wrong lessons from this episode as we face down more uncertainty and potential for more weaponization. I think without some clear analysis and some economists and trade economists in the room, we're at risk of pointing economic weapons at ourselves as we try to restrict trade and restrict investment in the name of security. Ideas like friendshoring that come out of the United States that seem to catch on everywhere will just make our world smaller. You know, we're talking about an open global economy with alternative buyers and sellers. Why restrict that to quote-unquote friends, whoever they are? The United States, as a like-minded friend, about to unleash a huge amount of protectionism on the whole world. So the security value of the multilateral system, I think, is underappreciated greatly. We're pretty obsessed, it started in the United States, and it's understandable to an extent elsewhere, about this small yard, high fence idea. Have some important technologies and important areas behind a small fence, protected behind a small yard and a high fence. And the idea is outside of that small yard, high fence to be very liberal. Well, in the United States, that fence has taken over the entire yard, and we're at risk in other countries of mission creep from security interests and that fence growing. I think for countries like Australia, for New Zealand, for Southeast Asia, we have to worry about the rest of the yard. Yes, you can have your small yard and high fence, stop that from growing, but keep the rest of the yard open and keep that from shrinking. So finally, and I think I've got about 5 minutes, I want to talk about what we might do collectively, because this is going to have to be a collective response. First, I think we need to realise the shared interests in an open, rules-based trading system. As we move to a multipolar world, as Natasha said, we need a multilateral system to govern that, so that we're not ruled by might and power, but ruled by rules. This is important for our prosperity, obviously, but it's also extremely important for our security. So small open economies like Australia, New Zealand, and those in Southeast Asia have the most to lose. It's important to remind ourselves, I think, here of the stake that the Chinese have in the established system. It's the largest trading nation in the world, has no formal allies, really. It is exposed. So it has a huge stake in this system that manages its risks from trade, from interactions with other countries, with the rest of the world. And that explains, I think, helps explain why it signs up to agreements like this multi-party interim arbitration arrangement. I'm missing an A there. Appeal arbitration arrangement. The workaround, because the dispute settlement system's not working. So for about more than two-thirds of the WTO membership, the rules are not enforceable. But New Zealand, Australia, China, European Union, Canada, and more recently Japan have signed up to this arrangement that's a workaround so rules are enforceable. China's putting its hands up for enforceable rules because it protects their own interests. I think this is where we need some more multilateral action, some coordinated action, like this MPIA plurilateral, to agree on rules from the bottom up. And this is where I think New Zealand's been extremely active in its economic diplomacy. You know, the P4 that turned into the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, Digital Economy Agreement, and others. I think we're going to need much more of that, but to be strategic in doing so. And we're going to need arrangements like those that are centred on ASEAN, and for all the reasons that Natasha mentioned, the ASEAN countries cannot choose between China and the United States. They don't want to pick sides. And the principles of non-discrimination, openness, inclusivity that they have, we need to accentuate those and work with them and use platforms like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement to protect our interests. So, you know, we're all pretty small countries compared to the US and China, but that's a fallacy of composition. We are all price takers, but if we work together collectively, we're a pretty big part of the global economy. So we need to appeal to and strengthen the multilateral system, not just in words, but in action. And we need to keep the system functioning while the United States sits out of it and welcome it back in when it's ready. And I think there's a pretty big agenda there for New Zealand, beyond what the Minister said of that's other people's problems, we can deal with our bilateral interests or our New Zealand interests. Yes, but if the whole economy, global economy is closing in on you, that's going to be pretty hard. So this is where New Zealand working with others to protect the global system is going to be very important. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Steve. It's a real pleasure to be here for the second time. I think this is a really worthwhile initiative, and I'm glad to be here today to offer you a private practice lawyer's perspective. I'm happy to take any kind of questions in the Q&A, but I wanted to focus my introductory remarks on a geopolitical development which I think is going to have very significant implications for New Zealand and Southeast Asia trade in the months and years ahead, and that is the outcome of the US presidential election. So what I want to talk today about is 5 things. What has President-elect Trump said he will do on tariffs? What is he actually likely to do? Is that going to affect New Zealand? Tariffs aside, what outcomes of the US election might impact our trade? And finally, because I don't like to do a presentation that ends on a downer, I'd like to say a few words about what we can proactively do as a country, as corporates, to preserve our position going forward. So, first of all, what did President Trump say on the campaign trail that he was going to do about tariffs? Well, a lot. He spoke about it a lot. He repeatedly pledged to put tariffs on imports, and the key things he's trying to achieve with this are shoring up US manufacturing, creating US jobs, and making billions in dollars in revenue to pay for other key flagship policies like his tax relief package. So, he's come up with lots of ideas. They kind of move around at the margins. But the key things are a 60% tariff on imports from China. He wants to remove American dependency on Chinese critical goods. 25% tariff across the board for imports from Mexico, unless it's a car, and then it's 100 to 200%. He's got this idea to introduce a Trump Reciprocal Tariff Act, which means if you're his trading partner and you have an 100% on an import of an American car, he'll put 100% import on an import of your car. But critically, there is one tariff that he's proposed which could have material implications for New Zealand, and that is this idea that for all other imports into the US, there would be a 10 to 20% tariff applied. That would apply to allies. He said that on the campaign trail, and therefore you'd have to assume that potentially includes New Zealand. So people talk a lot of bluster on campaign trails. I'm glad Minister McClay's not here, but we all know that to be true. So what is he actually likely to do? I think we need to look at a few things in order to get a sense of that. So first of all, it's important to understand that there are actually a lot of existing executive authorities in the US, which means that the US president, following an investigation by an administrative agency, can impose tariffs at his own discretion. So if there's any trade lawyers in here, have a look at sections 201, 232, 301 of the US Tariff Act. So he used these authorities 5 times during his last term. This was to impose widespread tariffs on China for unfair trade practices, on steel and aluminium. And it's important to recall that those tariffs of 10 to 20% were also imposed on allies, including New Zealand. We tried to lobby for an exemption, we didn't get one. And also there was widespread tariffs imposed on imports of washing machines and solar panels because they were thought to hurt domestic producers. So he's done this before. I think what's different this time round is he's very set on this tariff policy. He's talked about it a lot on the campaign trail. He is experienced and confident now. He's emboldened by the election result. He has won both arms of Congress. He's not seeking re-election. He's not going to be around a lot longer. And he's surrounding himself, if you're looking at the picks that are coming out for his administration, he is surrounding himself with people who back his tariff policy. So the helpful thing for us, though, is there are many things within the trade discretion that the president cannot do. So for some of the more controversial and broad tariffs that he's talked about applying, he will need congressional support. That includes, I think, the 10 to 20% tariff he wants to impose on all countries, which would include New Zealand. And even though he has a majority in the Senate and the House, I do not think that a proposal to apply a broad tariff is going to fly through necessarily. Whenever you're on the campaign trail, you obviously haven't taken detailed advice from officials, and it is quite possible that a lot of the government advice from officials will be actually, if you look at the first term, these tariffs don't actually save our economy, they don't reduce the trade surplus, they actually cause inflation and are a net harm to domestic consumers. So we may see some good advice come to the fore. There will be lobby groups on either side. Look at National Retailer Federation in the States or US Chamber of Commerce, they've come out very strongly against the tariff package. On the flip side, I think we have to look, there'll be a lot of producer organisations in the States that are keen on this. And for New Zealand, we must watch carefully what RCAF and the American Sheep Industry Association say, because they are very keen to see import tariffs imposed on sheep meat imports from New Zealand in particular. Trump may be concerned in some respects by what trading partners say and potential or threatened trade retaliatory action. He may also be concerned to some extent about legal challenge. Not so much legal challenge at the WTO because the appellate body is not functioning. And honestly, it's quite interesting when you have a case before the American Trade Commission, they're really not interested in WTO law. So I don't think they'll be worried about that, but they will be concerned about domestic legal action in the States, and there may well be some. All this to say, there's a lot of water to go under the bridge, but I do think we should assume that President Trump is going to impose a significant number of new tariffs in this coming term. So key question, I guess, is New Zealand going to be affected? And it's impossible to know for certain, but the potential harm to us is real and significant, so the prudent thing to do is to prepare as though something might happen. It's helpful when you think about this to understand the significance of the US market for New Zealand. So the US is our second biggest export market overall. It is a very significant market for sheep meat, for beef, for wine, for dairy, for fish and for wood. So very much a primary product market. We also have they're our number one market for export of services. Helpfully, when you consider goods and services together, we've got a relatively good trade balance with the States, and Donald Trump doesn't like to see a trade deficit, so that's helpful. But we have a very strong surplus in trade and goods, and that might not make him so happy. In terms of the ways things can play out, if the new administration looks to impose tariffs first on a country-by-country basis, we are not going to be the focus. The focus will be on big countries that have a trade in goods surplus with the US. So first in line, China, Mexico, Vietnam, Germany, particularly on cars, they are going to be the first focus. If the administration focuses on a sector-by-sector basis, again, we're not going to be the primary focus. That's going to be on, if you collate all the different statements Trump made during the election period, that focus is going to be on electronics, machinery, consumer goods, automotives, pharmaceuticals, technology, energy, aerospace. So not key sectors in which New Zealand plays, but agriculture also has featured in his comments. So we need to be wary that agricultural tariffs could be part of the plan. If a broad 10 to 20% tariff is imposed on imports from all goods, that would catch New Zealand. I think, honestly, we'd be a bit naive to think that we are going to get New Zealand-specific exemptions as an ally. We weren't able to achieve that with steel and aluminium, and I don't imagine we will be able to negotiate sector-specific, company-specific relief. We're simply not big enough to take up all the administration's time. They'll be dealing with lots of other fish that they consider to be more important than us. In addition to the direct potential implications of tariffs, there's also indirect effects, which Shiro was talking about, that if particularly a lot of Chinese goods are no longer able to be put into the US market at all or profitably, they will end up on the world market competing with our goods. So there may be stiffer competition for some New Zealand producers and exporters in the months and years ahead. There may also, some good news here, there may also be some windfalls because there may be a lot of consumer goods in the next year or so that have suddenly had to be redirected, and we may find them coming into the New Zealand market cheaper than usual. I think the single biggest threat of the potential US tariffs, the single biggest threat for New Zealand is for our sheep meat industry. Two trade associations, RCAF and the American Sheep Industry Institute, have for years been lobbying the US government for tariff relief from imports from New Zealand. They claim that we dump product in their market, that we subsidise production, and that safeguards are required because of the tsunami of cheap product coming into the States and undercutting them. There were a couple of petitions that were put on pause a year and a half ago, but I would not be surprised, and if RCAF's recent press releases are anything to go by, I would not be surprised if they're one of the first groups to go in to the new administration after inauguration on 20 January to request tariff relief from New Zealand importers, from New Zealand exports. So I really think sheep meat industry is one to watch. How am I doing for time? 5 minutes? Okay. We will just... So many notes. Let's see. Here we are. Right. So let's just skip straight to the good bit, because I feel like we probably need that, and think about what can New Zealand exporters and the government supporting us actually do to protect our positions. I think the first bit of advice is act now. We have a window of opportunity before Inauguration Day to prepare ourselves, to shore up our supply chains, to check what our exposure looks like and adapt where we can. For businesses, the first thing they need to do is understand the extent of their exposure. So look at your supply chains, dust off those supply contracts, have a read, who's paying the tariff. If it's you, and that's not going to be sustainable going forward, look further in the contract for provisions that allow you to negotiate in unforeseen circumstances like this. Renegotiate your contracts where you can. When drafting a new supply contract going into this environment, ensure you include provisions that allow for a bit of flexibility in light of this unforeseeable future we have. You really need to think carefully about exploring alternative strategies, whether that's considering shipping goods early, and stockpiling them, whether that includes doing final stage processing in the US or potentially diversifying into safer markets. That may be in Southeast Asia. Australia, honestly, is always a pretty safe market. Monitor policy developments closely. This is a fast-moving feast, and I think there is an opportunity, if you are watching closely, to modify your strategies as you go. And leverage advocacy networks. So this means working with your customers, trade associations, government agencies and others, because there's a lot more strength in a united voice, and we can support each other as we go ahead. So in summary, I think just to say there's some very significant proposals out there that could have a significant impact in New Zealand. And I think maybe just to underline the significance of that, if the proposal was a 10 to 20% tariff and you make maybe a 5 to 30% export margin on a sale to the US, a lot of exports just simply won't happen, and many others simply won't be as profitable as they were. So this could have a serious impact. I think we need to take these threats seriously, but helpfully there are plenty of constructive things you can do to prepare yourselves, and I think we need to all encourage our business community to take those steps and to do that now.
Let's have a clap for the panellists. Thanks very much to all three of you. Just a couple of quick points I wanted to make as well. I'm in no way qualified to speak to what New Zealand could or should do, so I'm not going to do that. But I do have a couple of thoughts that I wanted to return to regarding the international order and changes to it, as well as China's presence in the region. Natasha, I couldn't agree more that there are fundamental shifts happening in the architecture of the region in a number of ways. What I was thinking while you were talking about that was, that's undeniable. What's it going to look like? And I don't know the answer to that, and I'm not sure anybody does yet. But I'm fairly confident, let's say 80%, in what it's not. In my line of work, I'm often asked, are we headed for some sort of new Cold War? Something like that. People use that expression often. Is there geopolitical competition in this region and others around the world that looks something like a new Cold War? And my gut instinct there, and this is just a take, is to say no, not really. Why would I say that? The short answer, I think, is complex interdependence. There are threats to that. We don't yet know what's coming down the pipe in terms of what the Trump administration is going to do. Nevertheless, my instinct is to say that there is enough of what we would call complex interdependence at enough overlapping layers and levels to classify whatever the region might become in terms of its order as fundamentally different from the actual Cold War. There was never a situation where the United States government owed the Soviet Union $1 trillion+ or anything like that. There it is. I don't think that we're headed for that kind of competition again. It will look fundamentally different from what we've known in the past as a Cold War. The second thing I wanted to mention was on the with respect to China and its regional presence and what China is. There's an awful lot floating out there in the ether about China and its status as the world's not fastest growing economy, but largest. Shiro used the expression, China is exposed. And that was the thing that resonated the most there for me. I'm thinking, yeah, that's certainly true, and in more ways than one. I don't know if it's necessarily mentioned often, but China is still a developing country and has developing country type problems. It is far more institutionally chaotic inwardly than is typically reported in the English-speaking world. And I think that that is something that is borne out in oftentimes its international level behavior as well. People in the room might be familiar with a flagship foreign policy of China's called the Belt and Road Initiative. There was a time when it went by a different name, One Belt, One Road, Idailu. And as I say, it's a flagship foreign policy of current paramount leader Xi Jinping. And there are competing views of what that is and what it means around the world. I think the stock line on Belt and Road would be something like, oh, well, it's a global network designed to facilitate the freer flow of commerce and culture and people. People-to-people ties are flagged as an element of that. And that what this means in practical terms is infrastructure development. It's shipping lanes, it's heliports, it's airports, it's roads, it's rail, it's all of that sort of thing. And that's true. There's a reason people talk about it that way. But Belt and Road is actually bigger than that. Sometimes in situations like this, I say I think Belt and Road is a brand. When some infrastructure initiative of China's government or some particular policy goes well, it's called Belt and Road, and when it doesn't go well, it's just never mentioned again. And this is because Belt and Road is in actuality the outward-facing dimension of China's own domestic development policy. It's very, very common around the world to hear people say, what's Belt and Road and how can we get on board with it? What can New Zealand do to get on board with Belt and Road? And I always want to say, you can and you should ask these questions, but remember that it's not about us and it never was. It's for China, fundamentally. right? It is the next phase, or a plan to get to the next phase of China's own domestic development. It was not for the world, and it still isn't. If the world happens to benefit, right, that's good and that's okay. But fundamentally, that's not really the core goal, I don't think. Now, we've got about 24 minutes or so. So I think the thing to do now is for you to get in on some of this. Maybe what we'll do, there's no other microphone, correct? I'm holding the only one for this. Oh, there is one. Okay. Suzanne, can I ask you to pass a microphone? Maybe I think what we'll do is collect up, let's say 3 or 4 questions at one go, and then we'll give the panel an opportunity to respond. Somebody want to take the plunge? Yeah, please. Here, I'll pass this one. Maybe I'll give this to you guys for now, and we'll.
Good morning. My name is James Kim Russell from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. My question is for Professor Armstrong. I'm interested to what degree you see the context of what you just discussed, so protectionism, friendshoring, all these aspects. There's an idea that this context is predominantly a US insurance policy against a conflict over Taiwan. I'm just interested in your thoughts on that idea.
In their hand. If you could introduce yourself as well.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. This is Jimena from Colombia, Consul General of Colombia to New Zealand. And I have a question regarding some other players that you haven't mentioned. Mostly our focus has been on the conflict between the US and China, but there are some other players, such as Russia, and the implication of these situations on the conflict in Ukraine and the situation in the Middle East. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on the implication of geopolitics in this new context, considered some other players. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Maybe we'll take one more for the time being, and then we'll have a round 2 in a few minutes. Up in the corner. Suzanne's on the way.
Kia ora koutou, Joanna Bishop here from Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. I just wanted to ask, kind of open to the panel, what they think China might do in terms of potentially stepping into the role that the US has traditionally played within the multilateral trading system, and how they might seek to change that and yet shore up the multilateral system in a different, more Chinese-dependent way.
Thank you very much. I'll pass this mic to the panelists. I'm not sure who wants to take a first stab, but.
Well, the first question was for Shiro. So.
Yeah. Look, thanks for the question, James, and I'll take your question and the last question. Is this about a Taiwan contingency and insurance? I mean, you hear a large number of reasons why all these policies are being undertaken in the United States. I think there's only a couple of things that have bipartisan support in the US, and that's on China and on trade. And we've got a marriage of the protectionists and the security hawks in Washington converging. So, yes, Taiwan's mentioned often, but so is everything else. And we've talked about a few of those reasons, shoring up US manufacturing, to solving all sorts of things, getting rid of the income tax and replacing with tariffs. I think it's important, no matter what reasoning justification is given, is to think about what the effects are going to be. So does this create insurance around a Taiwan contingency? Well, that's something that should be studied fairly carefully. If you think about the Inflation Reduction Act and trying to produce more semiconductors in the United States, yes, it seems like you're no longer reliant on Taiwan and TSMC in Taiwan for the cutting-edge semiconductors, but you're also weakening the semiconductor shield in Taiwan. Right? So there are some pretty big implications for these with these policies. And I think this is where it's going to be pretty important. in our response too. So I mentioned the economic security policies of Australia, Japan. Everyone seems to be getting in on the act. I'm not sure about New Zealand. You can tell me. It's a pretty infectious disease, this economic security idea. So you probably are looking at it. We have to make sure we know this is going to be costly to business. That's the governments implementing these policies are pretty open about that. It's not clear to me that they're going to make us safer and more secure. So there still needs to be a lot of work. Does this reduce our exposure to China? Does it paint China into a corner? And trying to cut off critical mineral supply to China that seems to be dominating. We've had experience at trying to do that to a rising power before with Japan in the 1930s. It didn't end too well. So I think that's just a word of caution for all sorts of national security reasons are going to be thrown in, but we have to be pretty careful of the implications. And just not to dismiss the national security concerns and the risks, they're real. But if we let those dominate, we're talking about the security interests having to focus on existential security risks, and the price that's willing to be paid for that are infinite. So, you're moving towards a corner solution of cutting off trade and investment in the name of security, and suddenly you're North Korea. So you've got to be pretty careful, I think, about getting the balance right in security, and not just because a Taiwan contingency will be catastrophic, retreating from trade. And that just leads me to the last question on China playing a leadership role. Well, it's not clear that the Chinese can do so. Even in the first trade war between China and the United States, China retaliated tit for tat, engaging in self-harm to get back at the United States, but did actually reduce a little bit their tariffs to the rest of the world. Now, if China really wanted to take a leadership role with the United States vacating that leadership role, it would liberalise much further and really abide by its commitment to the rules that it's already done. And that would be a huge plus. And that's the kind of leadership we want from China. But every time China is going to try to take initiative in regional or multilateral affairs, there's a lot of concern from the rest of the world, and rightly so. So I think it's going to have to be nested in a collective leadership framework, and that's why we need ASEAN plus arrangements, APEC, RCEP, all sorts of other arrangements to create the framework for China to be able to make commitments, liberalisations, and show leadership in that sense. Because if it tries to show Belt and Road type initiative, leadership, it's met with suspicion, and usually the Chinese are a bit ham-fisted in this. It's about Chinese interests, not providing global or regional public goods.
Let me try and respond to the question about other players and, things like global conflicts, Russia, Ukraine, the Middle East, and so on. And I don't have any insight into those conflicts themselves. But what I have noticed listening to the foreign policy debate in some of the Southeast Asian countries is that the perceptions and expressed views on what is happening out there in some of the major Southeast Asian countries are not the ones that we hear most prominently articulated in the English-speaking world. And maybe I should rephrase English-speaking world, because I'm also thinking particularly, for instance, of a very careful analysis, for instance, of the Ukraine conflicts that came from the Singapore Home Affairs Minister. And this was a reading of how the conflict had developed that was very much, it was very diplomatic, but it was very much at odds with the narrative that comes out of Washington, which I think is the one that prevails in much of the sort of international press, like the Financial Times, The Economist, and so on. And again, I think if you listen to foreign policy thinkers in Malaysia, in Indonesia, you actually will hear quite different concerns articulated. And I think it's easy to forget that because many Southeast Asian countries do have concerns about China, its claims in the South China Sea, and have been quite grateful to live with the US security guarantee for the last 50 years. That does not, and two of them are formal US allies, but that does not mean that all countries in the region have the same perspective. So the conflict in Gaza, for instance, is an explosive one. And of course, the dominant view in much of the region is very much not in line with the US position on this. But also, interestingly, I mean, no one is happy to see Russia invade Ukraine, but I think the strategic perception of why Russia did that and what the best way to manage it is quite different. So I think the views in the region are distinctive. Just very briefly, as a footnote to what you said, Shiro, on China's role, I mean, China has applied, as you mentioned, it's joined the multi-party interim agreement at the WTO, it's applied to join the CPTPP, it's applied to join DEPA. So I think China has, it does have a real interest in making these multilateral institutions work. The speculation, of course, is, it may be, is what would we see in terms of the specific rules that a Chinese-led multilateral framework would favour, and they might be slightly different from the old Washington Consensus ones, not that there's anything left of the Washington Consensus. So, for instance, we've seen on data and digital standards, Chinese leadership pushing for sort of slightly different kinds of data standards and digital standards. And so the content of the rules themselves, I would expect to shift because China's development model is quite different, and there's no particular reason why they would look at the US and say, yeah, we want to do what they did, and have the same rules governing our economy and corporate governance and state-owned enterprises and so on. So I think they would have different rules. But my sense, and Steve, you might have a thought on this, is that the China's policy is committed to trying to maintain multilateral agreements, to have some kind of rules-based trade and economic cooperation.
I think I'll focus some comments on your question about the Russia-Ukraine conflict and what's happening in the Middle East, and then maybe say a couple of sentences on the other two questions. So I think we're at a very critical moment in terms of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. During the campaign trail, President Trump made it very clear that he does not want to keep funding that war, and there's a lot of support within the Republican Party for pulling back. And of course, they have the majority in the Senate and in the House. So Vladimir Zelensky can see this, Putin can see this, and so can Joe Biden. And interestingly, there was a plea that has been on Joe Biden's desk most of the year. Please let us use these long-range missiles in Russia. And no one has said anything. It is not surprising that permission has been granted now. And the Germans and the Brits have also allowed their weapons to be used inside Russia. So I think this is a very critical moment, and you would assume that both sides are trying to claw back the best position they can so that when President Trump comes in, they're in the best position to negotiate a good settlement. So, I mean, we're not in a cold war there, we're in a very hot war, and I think it'll be very interesting to see what happens in the next couple of months. On the Middle East, I know less about that conflict, but my understanding from reading the FT is that President Trump's position on the Israel-Palestine conflict looks like largely a continuation of the Biden view. There is strong support for Israel, which means that I think, unfortunately, things are going to continue to deteriorate in that situation where you can see more players within the Middle East being brought into this. You already have Lebanon and Gaza and Israel. You have Iran coming in, the Saudis, the Emiratis. I mean, that situation, unfortunately, is still looking very precarious. So I agree with your comment earlier, Steve, that we're not in a cold war, but we are in a hot war. And unfortunately, that could spread a little bit. Just quickly on the friendshoring point, I think you're right that the US is looking to friendshore partly because of concerns about Taiwan. It's interesting that some of the world's leading chip manufacturers are actually based in Taiwan, and two of them have set up sort of satellite manufacturing facilities in the States for precisely the concern that you talk about, the Chinese potentially coming into Taiwan. And finally, on the question of Chinese leadership in the international order, I mean, I think China will assume a role in a number of different fora. They want to join CPTPP and they'll be involved in other discussions. But in terms of can they unlock anything at the WTO, I would say the answer is no, and that's because of the way you need consensus decision making, and the Americans are roadblocking a number of things, as are others. And the WTO really has been in some semblance of a state of paralysis for my entire professional career. So I don't think we should be looking at that and assuming that there's going to be a big change at the WTO. Bit sad, isn't it?
Thanks. Natasha, I agree. Yeah, China is both incentivized and inclined to do these things, just not blindly always. The argument that was really popular maybe 20, 25 years ago was something like, well, China may be less inclined to participate in these kinds of multilateral structures because they didn't have the hand they wanted to have in creating them. And so that's changed a bit now. There's a stronger push for China to exercise some influence, at least, over the construction of modifying norms. I just made that term up. Has anybody coined that? Someone else, a couple of other questions out there. We've got about 8 or 9 minutes or so. Okay, if you've got the other microphone. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much to the panel.
Thanks very much to the panel. Yes, hi. Catherine Grant, Makukira. I had a question first for Sarah. Sarah, when I think about tariffs, I also think about rules of origin. So I'd be interested in your take on whether we will also see rules of origin playing a significant role in the Trump trade policy going forward, and thinking about putting big tariffs on Mexico, for example, immediately comes to mind the agreement that exists between the US, Canada and Mexico, which had quite significant changes to rules of origin in its last iteration. Mm-hmm. And then I had a second question really based on the observations about China and China's role for Shiro and maybe Natasha and Steve as well, as BRICS Plus. I'd be interested in any views on BRICS Plus and the expansion of BRICS, which we are seeing. It's not something we tend to talk about at this end of the world very much, but I work a lot in the African context, and it's very much, I think, seen in partnership with the Belt and Road Initiative that Steve was talking quite a bit about. And there is a lot of activity in advanced developing countries around BRICS Plus. So I'd be interested in any of your views about that as a tool that's been used by China and India as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I reckon we can wedge in probably one, possibly two others.
No, wait.
Oh, here comes the microphone.
I know.
Yeah. So that we can fit everybody, I'll ask everybody to keep it terse.
Thank you. My name is Anush and I work at the WTO. So I've heard what Ms. Elliot has said. So my question goes to the other panelists. What's the role of the WTO? Do you think it's still relevant? Everybody's saying that WTO is dead, that Trump killed it anyway in the first mandate, and that it's going to be just a very fancy think tank in the future. So what would be your point of view about that? Thank you.
I think there was one other gentleman in the blue jacket. Yeah.
Tēnā koutou katoa, nā mihinui mō tō kōrero. Connect Bothwick tā koingoa, and work for MFAT manatu aurere. But Natasha, you spoke of an order transition. Shiro talked of contagion of protectionism. Sarah said we must act now. Sarah, thank you. Yesterday you hosted a great panel with New Zealand businesses, some great tech businesses. The leader of one of those businesses, Rush Technology, said New Zealand works best by nudging giants. We've got to act now. What nudges do you think New Zealand can most usefully make given this context? Kia ora.
Microphone for who wants to go first.
Maybe first an apology to Anush. I should have read the program. If I knew you were here, I would have moderated myself. I am a believer in the WTO, despite what I say. So Kath's question on rules of origin, and for anyone who doesn't know, a tariff is a tax on imports, but rules of origin is basically how you establish that you're eligible for a preferential tariff. So it's providing proof. And Kath, your question was, if there's going to be all these tariffs imposed, is there going to be a heightened focus on rules of origin in the States? Absolutely yes. And there was last time with the Trump tariff, because in a way, what is the point is on putting up tariffs to keep imports out. People are quite wily. They find other ways to sneak in via different countries. So you have to know that, US Commerce Department and Customs Border Protection needs to know that a product is where it says it's coming from. There was heightened surveillance during the first Trump term. They send these long, long letters asking for all sorts of different things that kind of take New Zealand exporters by surprise, and it's quite a pain, to be honest, to respond to those. But yeah, there will certainly be a heightened focus on rules of origin going forward. And to your question, I think Danu from Rush Digital is so exciting, and I think think that the idea that we should be nudging giants is a really good one. I mean, we do a lot of amazing nudging here. I think in the US context, there is going to be a lot of people wanting to nudge the administration in the new year. I don't think individual corporates are going to get an audience, but I think who we should all nudge is people like Vangeli, because I do think our government is in the best position to advocate for us here, but they're only as good as the information that we give them. So they will only be able to fight for us if they know what we need. Also, I think we need to nudge our US partners. So whether that's our customers, trade associations that believe in us. There's a lot of people in the House and the Senate who love New Zealand for whatever reason. We need to nudge people on the inside, because I do think the incoming administration is going to be far more interested in what Americans think about this than what we think about this down under.
Yeah, I mean, I just underline that I teach non-market strategy to my undergraduates, and it's always better to be finding someone on the other side who has aligned interests with you and will be your champion. And I've noticed that other countries are getting in really fast with their statements about how many US jobs depend on the FTA, for instance, with Singapore, or, so it really helps to sort of, I guess, in a new, very transactional environment, to sort of be able to have those champions and to be visibly sort of aligned when it's helpful. I just want to mention, I don't know a great deal, I don't focus on the BRICS, but I think it's very easy to dismiss the BRICS as full of contradictions and, the line is incoherent and they're competitors with each other and all sorts of other things. I think that would kind of miss the point, though. I think that it is another manifestation that a number of important large countries are dissatisfied with the way things are, that with the global leadership that is currently not being provided on so many issues. And in a way, it could be, I think it is not quite the same, but, the old non-aligned movement of the 1970s, which was to say, the whole world should not be caught up in a Cold War and there are other things going on. And I think, we'll get yet to see what tangible initiatives the BRICS might pursue, but I think it represents quite an enduring and significant concern, and that therefore I wouldn't dismiss it for some of the obvious weaknesses.
I think, is the WTO still relevant? I gave what I thought was a fairly spirited defence. Not only is it not dead, it's still functioning as a reference point against protectionism, and it was the exit ramp for Australia and China from coercion. Now, there needs to be a lot of work, but I think that's where countries like New Zealand can take a leadership role with countries that still have a stake in the system, which is pretty much the rest of the world, in not just abiding by the spirit and the rules, and not just in rhetoric, but acting in that way, but then doing the bottom-up work on plurilateral arrangements that support the system instead of weaken the system. And I think that's where BRICS, it might be a distraction, but what are the features we want from arrangements, open accession, doubling down on non-discrimination, those sorts of features, I think will be important. And this relates to the nudging point, and I think that's important. There's some important work out of Singapore, Danny Kwah, who you may know, on trying to nudge third nations, nudging countries and having inadvertent cooperation, as he calls it. And I think that's a start, and that's how we need to think. But I want to go further than that, to think about how we can build some frameworks and consensus to get back to concerted unilateralism again, like the APEC days and the Bogor goals. So you don't just have inadvertent cooperation, you actually have countries working in their own interest towards a goal with positive spillovers for the rest of the world, not negative spillovers. Thanks.
I'll add my thanks once again to Shiro, Natasha, and Sarah for their insight, and to Jen and the PPI for having us. I reckon I'm getting that look because it's tea time. Yeah. In that case, I think you should all give yourselves a clap. And if there are other questions, we'll do it over something to drink. Thanks, everybody.